Why don't you give our listeners a little bit of an excerpt of why you decided to write Finish Big? Because that was one of the biggest things that intrigued me when you had said, how you came to the conclusion that it was worth filling a void. Your voice was out to be heard because there was a void in the market.
Well, it was, I think I explained this in the introduction. It was basically, I'd been at Inc. for many years, but when I started working on it, I think it was something like 25 years. And Inc. never really looked at exits, never talked about it, never wrote about it. And in that, I think that the magazine sort of reflected its readership, because if there's one thing most entrepreneurs don't like to think about and talk about, it's the end of the journey, it's the exits. And so that changed when Norm Brodsky, who I do the column with in Inc., came back from a conference and told me that he had met somebody, private equity firm, that wanted to buy his company, and that he'd named a couple of conditions, and which he thought might be deal breakers, and yet they didn't have a problem with them at all. And so, I said to him, maybe we should start writing about this in the magazine, and he said, sure, why not? Now, of course, in retrospect, there were many reasons why not to do it.
I was just going to say that again, the fact that he just jumped on board with that is kind of unique.
Yeah, it was very unique. And I have to say that the prospective buyers weren't all that thrilled with the decision. But we started doing this weekly series in Inc. Called The Offer, not weekly, monthly series called The Offer, in which we wrote about exactly what was happening in as close to real time as you can get in a monthly magazine. And, we went through his whole perspective on it and what his emotions were, and, his very mixed emotions about the possibility of selling this business that he'd spent most of his adult life building, and wondering what it was going to be like afterwards and all that. And at one point we had asked our readers if they could give him advice about what he should do, and we were just flooded with emails, almost all of them saying, "Go for it, Norm," in fact, he did finally decide, yes, okay, he was going to go through with the deal, and that was a big deal for the magazine. And in fact, the editor of the magazine decided it was such a big deal that she would put Norm on the cover with a cover line saying "Norm decides to sell," so that was the issue that was coming out. And then we still had to do one, given the production cycle of magazines, you have to do things sort of in advance. So in any event, right after that came out, a couple of weeks later, I called him up and said, okay, well, what are we going to do for the next column? And he told me, well, actually, I decided not to sell. I said, Norm, we just put out on the front cover of a national magazine that you've decided to sell. He said, well, he said, and he was, I think, as shocked as anybody. I was certainly shocked, but he was shocked that he'd actually made this decision. And I asked him what happened, and he said, well, there'd been some key information that he hadn't been get privy to until the very end, namely who was the key decision maker among the buyers. And it turned out to be the person who he trusted least. And there had been all kinds of commitments that had been made as to how his employees would be treated, various other things as well. And he realized that he could no longer trust them to fulfill their, to live up to their promises. And so, given that situation, given that he didn't trust them anymore, he didn't want to go forward with the deal. So,
which is amazing, by the way. Sorry to interrupt. I want to put a little emphasis on this because, one of the times we tried to sell our business in the 08, 09-ish time, and a lot of people say once the sale train is kind of going, they just pretty much just blindly go with it. So for him to be on the cover of an Inc. magazine and right. pull the and pull back is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I think he was actually shocked as well when I talked to him about it. It was like, I said, I can't believe you did this. And he would say to me, well, I can't believe I did it either.
But that's crazy courage because, that just proves to everybody out there that you're not on the cover in Inc. magazine. You still can say no.
Yeah, right. So anyway, we wound up not, from that point on, he did, wind up selling a majority stake in his business, and there was a whole process that happened after that, but we didn't write about it in the magazine because I think by that point he realized that there was a downside to writing it in the magazine. And so we didn't write about it actually until after it had happened, but basically the response that we'd gotten from readers while we were doing it made me realize that there was this sort of hunger out there and curiosity among people about, well, what is this experience like? And I did some research online to look and see what was out there, and the fact is that there's little, if anything, out there that's actually about the experience of going through the exit. There's a lot of things out there about, how to make sure that you get the most money and so forth. And I'm sure that a lot of that is actually very good and important and helpful to people. But there's almost nothing about the experience. And so I talked to my publisher about it, and he thought it was actually a good thing to write about. So we developed an understanding about that I was going to go forward with it, and so there I am. And one of the first things I realized is that other than what I knew about Norm's experience, I really didn't know anything about this. It wasn't something that I'd been aware of before I'd written. Norm and I had done this series of columns.
What was the thing that, was there a specific story or experience or interaction you had with someone that kind of realized how much you didn't know about it?
No, I figured that out pretty quickly on my own. And I realized, well, look, the first thing I have to do is I have to educate myself. And I began, asking people for stories, if they could introduce me to people who had stories. I had a friend who ran a Vistage chapter here in the Bay Area, and I asked him if he would mind sort of putting out the word to Vistage chairs around the country. He said he was very happy to do that, and I began hearing from companies and from Vistage chairs about companies that I ought to look into because they had good stories. And so, I followed up. I did somewhere between 100 and 150 interviews.
What's your favorite? What was your favorite one?
That's hard to say. They were, every single one of them was unique. Every single story was unique, and there were happy ones and there were not happy ones, and I'd have a hard time citing a favorite one. There was one that I did, which is actually the opening chapter of the book, and that one I actually did in person. I did a little bit online with Ray, but in any event, I decided that I really wanted to go see him and see in person what was going on. And
was he the one with the security system?
His company, had the security system, the cameras.
Yes, yeah.
When I went to see him, he'd sold the company, and he was on his boat, and he took me on which was sort of his reward that he'd given himself.
Nice. For
having done this. It's a beautiful boat, by the way.
I bet.
and he was actually sort of sheepish when he sort of showed me around the boat, like he was a little embarrassed at how nice it was. In any event, I went to see him, and the thing that really struck me in his story was that it had actually turned out so well for him. Here he'd originally gotten an offer, and he'd gone to actually his Vistage chair, and the Vistage chair had said, well, you can probably get a much better offer if you take some time and make some changes in your business. And he decided to take that advice, and he did make some significant changes in his business and how he ran his business, because up to then he was sort of the typical entrepreneur, the benevolent dictator. and he really sort of had to change things to get more people involved and, to really try and implement some best practices. And it was hard. It was hard because part of that involved letting people voice everything that they sort of felt, in every way that they felt he was falling short. And he had to sort of sit there and listen to it and try to understand it and, figure out what to do about it. And so that took a lot of courage on his part.
Do you think that it takes, and we can, because I think you kind of specified this in your book a little bit, but do you think it takes an LOI or a random offer or something to awaken the owner to have or accept this feedback or kind of change their direction?
For some people, yes. There are, it depends a lot on the individual, but Ray was somebody who'd been going on. He was getting along in years, and he knew he'd reached an age where it had dawned on him that he was not, in fact, going to live forever. And he also had a son with some serious disabilities, and he wanted to spend more time with him. And he was thinking about the things that he wanted to do with the rest of his life. And when this offer came along, it was like, well, I really ought to pay attention to this. I mean, if he'd had that offer 20 years earlier, 15 years earlier, he might not have paid attention to it.
Yep. So kind of more the timing and the life cycle of the person and the business and a lot of other combinations combined, huh?
Yes, exactly. And the thing also that struck me was, I mean, he'd made one of the changes that he'd made was to set up sort of a phantom equity system in his company, so that the employees would all, benefit from whatever sale happened. Now, his employees didn't know what to make of this. Most of them, I talked to some of them, and they all said that it was just sort of a little weird because this was in contrast to the way that he had run the company up until then. But in fact, he did change his whole management style, and people saw that, and people's responsibilities changed, and there were other things that happened that were fortuitous in terms of improving the value of the company. In any event, he worked on this for 4 years before he, was felt he was really ready to sell. And in the end, he got a significant multiple of what the original offer had been. I think it was 4 times what the original offer had been.
Holy buckets. 4 years and 4 times. I'd say that's a pretty good return.
It was pretty good, and partly it had to do with what he had done in the company, and partly it had to do with his timing, because things had changed in the wider world, mm-hmm. and it happened to be he happened to wind up selling at a point where the market was very good for a company like his, and
which you can never always foresee. It's kind of just, that's more luck of the draw than anything, right?
Well, yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because, a lot of advisors or professionals or other business people or owners, when they're on the golf course, everybody focuses on the multiple or how much they got, etc., right? I mean, and one of the biggest things that my dad and I related to, and like you said, I saw myself in your book, was that it isn't all about the money, and there is a lot of other things that the owners have to do to quote unquote finish big. So can you kind of give us a little bit of a rundown, on our listeners?
That was one of the things about Ray Pagano, because when I sat down to write, and by then I'd done lots and lots of interviews, I wanted to open with somebody who'd actually had a good exit.
Got it.
And one of the things about Ray that made his exit a good exit was that he was very proud of the fact that whenever he went back to the company, his former employees were very welcoming and had very warm feelings toward him, and really totally welcomed him, and were obviously wishing him well, and they had good feelings about it. And for him, that was a very significant thing. It doesn't always happen that way, but it was very important for him in that it gave him, and what I don't even think he appreciated how important it was, because it gave him peace of mind about what had happened to the other people who had been on the journey with him. And when I actually sat down, I would say when I began my interviews, the most striking thing was that I began running into lots of people who were very, very unhappy. I mean, I would say that it was about half and half in terms of people that I interviewed, although other people who have more experience in this area than I do say it's more like 70-30. It's 70% are unhappy afterwards. And when I found that, I said, well, that's obviously the book I need to write. What's the difference between the ones who wind up happy and the ones who wind up unhappy? And so that's what I was. And one of the things I had to do once I decided that was the book I needed to write, I had to ask myself, well, what do I mean by happy exit? Mm-hmm. And I came up with, 4. When I looked at the people who'd had the people I'd interviewed, I realized that there were at least 4 characteristics of a good exit, and for some people there was a 5th one as well. The first one was that they felt that the process had gone, they'd been through a fair process and they'd gotten a reasonable reward for the work that they'd put into building the business. The second factor was that they could look back on what they had done and feel a pride in knowing that they had actually built something of value, that had contributed something positive to the world, and that they could feel pride about what they had done. Their feelings were not colored by other things. And then the third characteristic was that, and it was very important, was that they were at peace with what had happened to the other people who'd been on the voyage with them. And since nobody builds a company, at least a sellable company, on their own, and I could see that a lot of people were very, very troubled afterwards by what had happened to their former employees or partners or their customers. And then the fourth characteristic was that they'd found something afterwards that they could really become engaged in, and that something that they could do afterwards that was, gave them a life after the business, as opposed to sort of drifting around, not sure what to do or who they were anymore, which happened with some people. So that was the fourth and a very important one. The fifth was, which wasn't true of everybody, but it was true of some people, was that they could look back at their companies were going on without them and doing well, which sort of gave them a sense of a legacy that they'd actually built something that could last after them. I found that those 4 or 5 qualities were defined for almost everybody what a good exit was. If you were missing just one of them, you could have a very bad exit. If you felt that the process hadn't been fair and you wound up getting screwed, well, you'd be upset about that. If you were so conflicted about what was happening that you couldn't look back with pride on what you'd done before, that could ruin everything for you. If your employees were getting screwed afterwards, that would be something that would make you very unhappy. And if you weren't able to figure out what to do afterwards, that was a very common one, and could make for a very unhappy exit. And for some people, if their customers were not what they had, or if their companies, either went out of business or were not doing as well as they would have liked, then that could make for an unhappy exit.
Well, it's interesting because your 4 to 5 characteristics. What I see in a lot of them is all the owners that I know and all the reason that I started my business, or my dad, or anybody that I've talked to, it's you start your company for freedom and control, right? And so there's such an incentive, or like a crazy sense of making sure that you're always trying to predict or envision the future, and then trying to control whatever chaos that you've got in front of you. And all of those characteristics are showing that they either didn't envision something that they saw coming, or it wasn't on their terms because they weren't able to essentially quarterback it. And there's so many variables when you're doing the exit that it's hard to. They don't do this all the time. I think you said that in your book a couple times.
Yeah. Well. Yes. Well, that's very true, Ryan. I think that then when I actually looked at the specifics of how people who had what people who had happy exits had done in order to wind up with those 4 or 5 characteristics, one of them for sure was that, and in fact, in many ways the most important one, was that they'd given themselves enough time to go through the entire process. A lot of people, went into it and were actually totally unprepared for what lay ahead of them, and because they hadn't given themselves enough time, and they hadn't actually gone through the whole process. I mean, that's a whole other issue because that really forced me, even though I'd been at Inc. and written about lots and lots of entrepreneurs and met lots of entrepreneurs, it was sort of a revelation to me that the whole way that I had thought about the process that you go through when you start or you buy a company, and that I had sort of the wrong idea about it, and the whole way that I looked at an exit, I had the wrong idea about that too, and I had to really revise those. And once I can talk about how I revised them. I mean, one of the things I realized was that when we talk about building companies, that's exactly the way we put it. That
right.
the process is about building a company, which is, as if it's sort of a construction project, the goal of which is to wind up with a great company at the end. And what I realized was that when you start or you buy a company, you become an owner, that in fact, it's not a construction process, it's a journey. And like every journey, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end isn't when you build that company. The end is when you leave that company. And that required you to sort of think about the whole process in a different way, a way that many people aren't aware of and aren't thinking about what they're doing, when most people are not thinking about. Most people are focused on, let's see if we can build something that will be viable and that will, allow me to. They think about what will happen. They think about wanting to start a company that's going to succeed in the sense that it will provide them with an independent source of income, and.
But it's kind of like going back to your construction process. Like when do you stop building? Like when do you open the front door and get to live in it, right?
Right, exactly.
Well,
and
go ahead.
Yeah, and so that was one of the big revelations to me, was that the whole way we think about the process that an entrepreneur goes through was flawed. Or at least the way I was thinking about it was flawed.
It's interesting. I talked to this gentleman. He was actually on my podcast a couple of interviews ago, and he told me that he goes, it's kind of like, your parents are telling you how to live your life, and you're like, yep. You'll understand when you have kids, and then all of a sudden you have kids, and you're like, I get it.
Yeah, right.
He said it's just like that, where until you've sold your company, you don't really understand. You can have all these people tell you it, but you don't really get that completes the journey on that one spectrum.
Right, exactly.
So I got to... Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead, Ryan.
So I got an interesting question for you, Bo, because your few books that, The Finish Big, Street Smarts, Small Giants, and The Great Game of Business are like some of my absolutely favorite business books. And the one thing that I keep going back to, because, it kind of revolves around that number 4, and the title of this podcast of Life After Business is how, and actually what Allie and Andrew do at Orange Kiwi is there's so much role identity fusion with the business owner and their company. Right. And you had mentioned it a lot in Small Giants, where you're talking about these companies that are just beautifully healthy, and their cultures and their communities, and what it takes to be a small giant. And you constantly go back to I'm wondering, can you be a small giant and finish big? And I'm hoping you can say yes, and I believe that you will. But the reason I want to ask that question, Bo, is because I see entrepreneurs as artists, right? Where you got, I'm building a business right now, and my dad did, and the people that I hire reflect me. How I get my customers reflects me. Everything is essentially me, throughout the business. And so how can you step away and then start to look at your business like an investment vehicle, which you had mentioned that John Warlow does a fantastic job at that? And how can you have both? How can you go in and love and have the passion for your company like you want to, and have a small giant and then finish big? Is that too much?
You put your finger on something that is very of great interest to me actually, because I have to say that writing Finish Big was one of the most educational experiences I've ever been through as a journalist, because I found out so many things about entrepreneurship that I didn't understand before. And, basically, the people who build small giants face the same challenge that everybody else does. I mean, every entrepreneur exits their business. They may exit feet first, but they're going to leave one way or another. And I did have a chapter in Small Giants where I talked about how, in fact, most of the companies that I had written about were not prepared for what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, by writing after I'd written Finish Big, I went back and thought about all those, because I actually, new edition of Small Giants just came out with 2 new chapters.
Yeah, I recently reread it, and it's interesting because you went back and visited some of them, huh?
Yeah, right. And things had happened. It was a very the 10 years was a very eventful 10 years. We went through the Great Recession, among other things, and obviously that affected everybody. And but it also got me to think about, this question that you just raised, namely, how does what I learned in writing Finish Big, how did that affect a company that is basically, aiming to create this sort of a great company? I mean, is that great company going to... a lot of people ask me when I went out talking about Small Giants, almost every time I spoke, somebody would raise their hand and say, it's, they love the stories that I told, but they said it sounds like that the leader is extremely important.
Right. Right.
Are these companies capable of remaining great after that leader isn't around anymore? And it was a really good question that people were asking me. And, I answered it honestly, which is, not necessarily.
The conflicts, it's so crazy because I 100% agree with you. And, there some of the stories, it's funny because you go back and forth. You want then John Warlow's 8 key drivers. You want to make sure you're not the hub of the spoke. But then you go to Norm Brodsky in City Storage, and he was calling customers, and that's why it was his personality throughout his whole company that allowed it to become what it is. And so I look at when my dad's business, started shaking and having the wheels kind of rumble is when he disappeared. And so
right.
How do you take that charisma and the personality and breathe it into the business and then walk away? I just don't know.
Well, when I will say this is that when I was writing Finish Big, I made it a point of trying to find businesses that had exceptional cultures, like the Small Giants, and that had managed to retain those exceptional cultures through at least 2 changes of ownership and leadership.
Interesting. Okay.
In other words, I could see how I could find companies that had succeeded in doing it through 1 change, but to do it through 2 changes, that really, so that because the second time it's going to be very far removed from the founder, and is it going to remain an exceptional company the second time? And the fact is that the only companies I could find where that was the case were either family businesses or employee-owned businesses.
Oh, crazy.
And when I thought about it, I realized that that's probably because the culture sort of needs guardians,
mm-hmm.
and in one case the guardians are the family. In the other case, the guardians are the employees. I will say this is that one of the things when I talk to companies, to Small Giants, or people who aspire to be Small Giants, the way I talk to them has changed as a result of writing Finish Big. One of the things I say to them is there are questions that you need to ask yourself early on, like, are you building a company that's going to last after you? Is that something you care about? If it is, if you're building a company that you want to make into a great company and you want it to remain great after you're gone, there's a whole process that you have to go through, which is extremely difficult, and it's extremely important to begin thinking about it at a very early stage of the business. The person who has attacked that best, who I write about in Finish Big, is my friend Jack Stack at SRC Holdings. He's reaching a point right now where he's already sort of told the company approximately when he's leaving. It's not just him; it's the other people in the company, and there are many key people in the company who are his age, and they will all be moving on around the same time. And so to prepare for that, there are all kinds of things he has had to do, and he's basically taken him. I mean, I've known him for 30 years, and it's taken him. He's been working on it for 30 years to try to get to that point, and I think he's got a good shot at it actually right now. But in watching what he has done to try to prepare for this and to try to prepare the company for it has really made me appreciate what a difficult process that is. I say to people, the most challenging thing in business is not, I always thought it was to build a great company. But I've now realized that the most challenging thing in business is to build a great company that remains great after you're gone.
That's about sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So what do you think is the most challenging? Is it? I mean, the emotional piece of it, right? Because there's so many financially driven entrepreneurs out there, right? And once they know where to focus on the financial piece or their customer concentration, all that is very tactical, right? Is there anything, whether it's Jack or Norm or some of these guys that or gals that you've talked to, that what have they done on the emotional side to help their bridge that or make that journey easier?
Well, Norm, he specifically did not, for him, he was not building something that he wanted to go on the same way as he'd run it after him. What his hope, and he thought about it, and his hope was that the people who had worked at City Storage would have learned things and taken things that they could then take to other companies where they went afterwards, but that basically he didn't feel that he was building a company that was going to last indefinitely and be run the way, and have the same kind of culture and the same way of doing business that he'd had, that had been when he was running it. Jack is different in that basically his idea all along was to give the next generation the kind of opportunities that he'd had, and that meant a lot asking people what they wanted. There were choices along the way. Did they want to go public? That was a possibility. Did they want to sell parts of the business to a private equity firm? Those were possibilities along the way. And, he just made sure that he just kept sort of throwing it back at the employees and asking them, and, so putting together groups that would actually ponder these questions about, well, what did they want to do? And the answer that always came back to him over and over again was, well, we sort of like what we've got right now, and we'd like to keep it going. And so that message was very clear to him, and he said, okay, he was going to focus on trying to set up a system that was able to last beyond him. And one of the things that he said, I mean, because I had many discussions with him about this, I asked him, is it possible for a very people-oriented culture to last beyond the individuals who created it? And his answer was that he felt the answer was yes if you had a hard culture as opposed to a soft culture. And what he meant by that was, when he meant a soft culture, he said a culture that is totally dependent on the goodwill and fatherly instincts of the person at the top. He doesn't feel that that is capable of going on. If, on the other hand, you actually have a system, a way of running the company that that creates the culture, that's different. That does have the potential to go on, and that's where he's focused his attention. From the very beginning, which was building, as he puts it, a business of business people, people who who know how to run a business and who can make the difficult business decisions that have to be made. They aren't exclusively depending on him to make those decisions. In many cases, they're making those decisions themselves. Obviously, he's one of them, so he's helping to make those decisions. But, he's very focused on making sure that he's not the only one involved in that. There are other people.
Like what Jack did, was way ahead of its time, because isn't he like pretty much the father of open book management? And what I loved about your guys' book was, in what he did was call on everybody else, like, hey guys, we're all kind of in a heap of trouble. Here's how you read financial statements. So whether it's the guy in the warehouse or your accounts receivable staff or the salesperson, everybody is looking at the same scorecard, because there's no reason. I think what the biggest, we were victim of it too, where, you feel like as the owner, you're the one that should hold all the burden and be alone and be looking at the scorecard by yourself, when everybody else they're technically your teammates.
Right. Well, you might want to be interested in another book, the one that sort of gets overlooked. It's the second book that I wrote with Jack Stack, called A Stake in the Outcome. A Stake in the Outcome is more of the story of what happened, and it includes a lot of the really difficult challenges that came up along the way. There were a lot of, at various points, crises that had to be overcome in order to do this, and in order to build the company that they have in fact built. And that story is told much more in A Stake in the Outcome than in The Great Game of Business. The Great Game of Business is really just laying out the system. The A Stake in the Outcome is as the subtitle puts it, building a culture of ownership, and it's
the raw story.
Yeah, right. Right, the hard parts.
I could keep going on for hours, Bo. I love it.
Okay. So, well, what do you want to do?
Well, I was going to say, if there's one, because our listeners are made up of the people that you interviewed in all your books. If there's one takeaway or one thing we haven't chatted about just yet, what would you leave with? What would you leave them with?
Well, the people I mainly write about, and the people I think who mainly are the readers of the things that I write, at least the ones who like what I write, are people who are building their own companies. They're entrepreneurs. And I would say that the most important thing to understand, there are a lot of things that I should I would sort of advise somebody to do. One of which is sort of the idea behind Small Giants, namely, what exactly is it that makes a company great? I think that, when you look at the companies in Small Giants, that's really the question that they put on the table. And different people will have different answers to that question, but it's a question that everybody should be asking. Mm-hmm. Namely, what are you looking for why are you doing what you're doing? What are you looking for out of business, out of work, out of life? And what does it mean to you? If your goal is to build a great company, well, what exactly does that mean to you? And in Small Giants, I suggest what the people I write about, how they answered that question. It wasn't always identical in every case, but there were some similarities. And I think that's a very important question for people to ask. But I think that if you were to really press me and to say what I think is the most important thing, and I would say it's very affected by what I learned in writing Finish Big, namely that you're on a journey and that journey is going to end, and that you need to think of it as a journey, not as a construction project. Construction project may be one of the things you do. It will be one of the things you do in the course of the journey, but it's important to understand that the journey it goes on beyond that. And you have to sort of think about not only you have to think about what happens in the journey, you also have to think about how the journey ends and what's going to happen after the journey. Are you going to have another journey? That's fine. Are you, in fact, building? Is your journey about building this great company that's going to last after you? That's fine too. Is it about, building a company and then selling it for as much money as possible? And I don't make any value judgments about that. I think that's a fine thing to do if that's what you really want to do. But the important thing is to be clear in your own mind. Well, as I say in both Finish Big and in Small Giants, to be clear in your own mind about who you are, what you want, and why. I think that I have found in the course of however long it's been that I've been writing about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial companies, the most important quality is something that is probably an important quality for everybody, whether they have companies or not, whether they're entrepreneurs or not, namely to really understand who you are, what you want, and why. That's not always an easy thing to do. In fact, it's a very hard thing. Most of us spend our entire lives trying to figure that out. The great poets and playwrights and
philosophers and everybody
and philosophers, right, have written about the importance of the struggle. The proper, as Alexander Pope put it, the proper study of mankind is man, meaning ourselves.
And then the man's search for meaning. You ever read that book?
Yes, yeah, sure, of course. Another one.
Yep.
That figures right into it.
Well, the intrinsic reflection of who you are is a lot more difficult than just quarterly reports, isn't it?
It sure is. And the other thing is that when you get to be my age, you realize that a lot of the times it's during the really tough times that you find out who you are, and you find out what it is that really matters to you. And, that's a whole process. As I say, it's something that you probably spend your whole life doing, but it's something that you need to be conscious of, that this is a challenge that lays ahead of you, and that you need to be working on and thinking about. Because, what I found with Small Giants was that all the companies, all the entrepreneurs who owned the companies that I wrote about were people who had very clear ideas of who they wanted and who they were, what they wanted, and why, because they couldn't have made the decisions that they did if they hadn't. Particularly, when people are telling you, a lot of people, if you don't know who you are, what you want, and why, what you wind up doing is what other people think you should do.
Right. Listening to all the other voices that are just your guide,
exactly.
that are sort of guiding you.
And it was also very important with the people in Finish Big, the people I wrote about in Finish Big. Again, the way people get into trouble is if they are really unclear about what it is that's motivating them. I tell the story of Bruce Leach, who was one of the founders of Evolve in Chicago, and how he basically wound up selling a large chunk of his company to a private equity firm without actually figuring out, well, what was it that he liked about his company?
Found out after that, I bet.
Yeah, he did. It took him a while, but he eventually discovered that what it was that he was missing. And, that's going to happen.
Well, Bo, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's an honor because I just love your work so much.
Well, I love the questions you ask, Ryan, and I love your story too. But I hope you've told that in one of your podcasts. Maybe you should interview your father in one of your podcasts.
Yeah, it's there's there's not enough oxygen in the room for both of us to talk.
Okay, all right. Well,
thanks for coming on the show, Bo. I appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure, Ryan. Thank you.
Talk